guys, welcome to the Simpsons Tidbits Halloween Special. These Simpsons Tidbits will be more Treehouse of Horror or Simpsons Halloween Special centric, with the exception of one, which is actually a Simpsons theory. So if you're just watching for the Simpsons theory of why I think Homer gets dumber and dumber every year, you can skip to this time. Anyways, the first Simpsons tidbit that we're going to be talking about is Treehouse of Horror related. I'm going to be talking about the canonization, if that's a word, of Kang and Kodos. Kang and Kodos, for the longest time, had only appeared in the Treehouse of Horror episodes, which have been established to be non-canon. So, for the longest time, everyone thought that Kang and Kodos were also non-canon. However, in Season 26, Episode 10, The Man Who Came to Be Dinner, the Simpsons actually go visit Rigel 7, where they're prepared as a ritualistic meal of some sort. Which is a funny tie-in, because as you guys know, in the second segment of the first Treehouse of Horror, the Simpsons think they're going to be eaten by Kang and Kodos, as a parody of the Twilight Zone's To Serve Man. Speaking of the first Treehouse of Horror episode, the next two Simpsons tidbits actually have to do with the first Treehouse of Horror episode. First is about the name Treehouse of Horror. Now, it actually wasn't called the Treehouse of Horror until Treehouse of Horror number 13, where it was actually called the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror. Until then, they were actually all called the Simpsons Halloween Special. But Treehouse of Horror is a somewhat strange thing to call the episodes, if you really think about it, in the context of someone who hasn't seen the very first Treehouse of Horror episode. The reason why it's called that in the first place is because in the very first Treehouse of Horror episode, which wasn't even called Treehouse of Horror, Bart and Lisa are telling scary stories in the treehouse. And that is where the first Simpsons Halloween Special stories originate from. And that is also why they are non-canon. They didn't actually take place. They were just stories that Bart and Lisa have made up. And that's how it has been. In fact, the setup continues in the second Treehouse of Horror. Instead, they're actually in the house, and they're all telling ghost stories. I guess they really liked the whole Treehouse segment version, so that's what they decided to call it. Eventually. The next Simpsons tidbit that has to do with the first Simpsons Halloween Special is the last segment of the first Simpsons Halloween Special. The parody of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Now, I have always hated Shakespeare. Ever since we've had to read it in school, I hate reading Old English. It's not something that I want to learn, and it's really boring to me. And Edgar Allan Poe writes in Old English. And I don't care about the context of the stories that they write, because you guys know that I like history, right? But I only like the 20th century and some of the late 19th century. Basically the start of industrialization, because that's when machines started becoming involved. The evolution of machines is what I think is interesting about history, or the evolution of certain art forms, specifically animation, which involves machines. So, I don't really care about Edgar Allan Poe and Shakespeare. That segment of the first Simpsons Halloween Special is terrible to me, and it drags very hard. And if I were to rank all of the Simpsons Halloween Specials, and I wasn't able to divide them into segments, like I had to choose it by episode, that would drag the first Simpsons Treehouse of Horror down like a lot. Even though they have the Twilight Zone To Serve Man parody, I mean, that's awesome, but it's not really quite enough to save it, because it's really that boring to me. And a lot of people agree, I mean, it's like, come on. I'm surprised that didn't just kill the whole Simpsons Halloween Special thing. And I'm sure that dragged even then to people in the 90s. People hated that, I'm sure. Now we're going to talk about my Simpsons theory. Why I think Homer gets dumber and dumber every season. Now, this has been addressed by all sorts of fans, and it's even been addressed by the Simpsons writers themselves in the Simpsons 138th episode Spectacular, hosted by Troy McClure. As Troy is reading fan letters, they actually may be real fan letters that they decided to put in the episode, but I'm assuming that they were just written by the writers themselves. A fan brings up the fact that Homer seems to be getting dumber and dumber every season or year. The evidence for why I think Homer continues to lose his intelligence every season or year all lies in Season 5, Episode 6, Marge on the Lam. In the first act of this episode, Marge and Homer are sitting at the breakfast table, and they're discussing the time when, to get out of going to Patty and Selma's, Homer volunteered to do Army experimental testing. There's a flashback sequence to the experience of the testing, and the military scientist disclaims to Homer that this serum he's about to be injected with causes hair loss, giddiness, and loss of equilibrium. Basically, it messes with his brain. And if that wasn't enough evidence for you, at the end of Marge on the Lam, there's actually a parody of a crime drama called Dragnet. And in this, they go through all the characters and basically their legal consequences of all of their actions. And when they get to Homer, they conclude that he was released to the custody of the United States government for extensive testing. As they're saying all this, Homer is looking around, and at the end, he goes, "Woohoo!" Classic, you know. But who knows what they're pumping him with then? That could be doing all kinds of stuff to Homer's brain, which could be causing him to be all kinds of stupid. And this is exactly why I think that Homer Simpson is getting dumber and dumber every season or year from experimental testing by the United States government.
Because this is the Simpsons Tidbits Halloween Special, I decided to choose a Simpsons proto-character that's somewhat special as well, and that is Ralph Wiggum. Now, why is Ralph Wiggum special? It's because the progression of his character was a very long process, and Ralph's character was barely finalized by the time of his spotlight episode, I Love Lisa. Ralph's first appearance here was in Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, playing the Japanese version of Santa Claus in the school Christmas pageant.
Here is the Simpsons Roasting Proto-Ralph's voice sample.
I am Hotsuyashi, a Japanese priest who acts like Santa Claus.
His appearance in Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire is not very interesting, and he's not credited even. But his next appearance in Season 1, Episode 6, Moaning Lisa, is very interesting. He looks totally different. His hair goes up instead of down. His nose is a lot longer instead of the short little nose that we know on him today. Unbelievably different character design. And it's especially weird that he looked very similar to his final appearance in the previous episode, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire.
Here is the Moaning Lisa Ralph's voice sample.
Hey, why don't you come over to my house after practice? You could do my homework.
The Moaning Lisa version of Ralph almost sounds a little bit like Nelson. Ralph's next appearance is not a speaking role. He's just a kid in the background of the kids watching the Nudie Channel in Homer vs. Lisa and the Eighth Commandment. However, something of note is when the kids are fleeing the house, if you pause on Ralph, his shirt is a totally different color. It's almost like he's wearing a sweater, actually, instead of his normal shirt. And something else of note is that Ralph is wearing his regular clothes in this appearance. So Ralph's next appearance in Bart's Friend Falls in Love somewhat reverts back to a more proto version of him, in terms of he has his blue but non-collared shirt, but he does improve in the voice department. His voice is closer to the final version of the Ralph Wiggum voice. However, it is still a little deep. Here is the voice sample for the Bart's Friend Falls in Love version of Ralph.
It's recess everywhere but in his heart.
Ralph's next appearance in Season 4, Episode 1's Camp Krusty reverts back even further. His character design is different. His head looks more slender and tall versus the shorter, rounder head of the more finalized Ralph Wiggum, and his voice is deeper once again.
A change of underwear!
And then there's the finalized Season 4, Episode 15, I Love Lisa Ralph, that we all know and love. Funny enough, this episode actually begins and ends with the Monster Mash, the perfect song for today.
The doctor said I wouldn't have so many nosebleeds if I kept my finger out of there.